All right, welcome back to. Are we week 4? Nobody knows for sure. I think we are. So we're coming into the 1980s and the 2000s. Punk music certainly is already established by the 1980s. It has a lot of growth, however, during the 80s and 90s. And so I entitle this Mainstreaming Punk question mark because it is um, a true question about is this a genre that can be mainstreamed or not. And so I'll share with all of you my take on the situation. So, how to define punk? Clearly we're looking at a sort of defiant underground movement that's defined as much on what it rejects and the act of rejection as any self-affirming type of thing. Um, and so, when we look at it in the context of the 1980s, the 80s was known for the interrogation, I guess, of youth identity um, based on a handful of blockbuster films that sort of proposed an array of different identities. Primary among those would have to be the Breakfast Club, where you've got incarnations of these different types. Um, I'm guessing that you all have seen this, or most of you have. But Weird Science, Revenge of the Nerds. They also did. They began to kind of operate on this constellation, and so um, what you see coming out of the 80s is that the category of the nerd, or the person who's defined on their book smarts, um, goes really through a renaissance and is sort of revalued, revindicated, relegated to a higher station than they had been before. And a lot of that is at the expense of like the athletic, the jock, right, the one who has the athletic prowess. And so what's interesting is that, so we're talking about like dealing with imaginary social space of how do we imagine youth identity, right? Um, and so the thing that's interesting about punk music is that it had been sort of playing with or rejecting these categories um, for well over a decade by the time these films came out. Um, so you can see sort of a reworking or updating of the 1950s Rebel. So the punk is kind of an extreme version of that. But really, it's more in terms of their rejection of these categories and what society, right, what society claims as norm, the normal sort of status quo, is completely unacceptable. And so that's really sort of the way that I see punk in its context. I also see it in two phases. So, the early phase and the late phase. In the early phase, it hasn't really been commodified or anything. It's just, like I said, a gesture of rejection of social norms. It's nihilist in nature, which means that, sort of lives for today but doesn't have, it's not like a hope based on a better tomorrow type of a situation. But it is, in its affirmation of the now, it does create a subcultural space. So it's like an underground movement that allows for misfits, those who have no place, on the surface in the mainstream, I guess you could say, to have a safe space of not worrying and to be crazy as hell or whatever if they want to. Um, and so there's a bond there. And so punk music is sort of the soundtrack to that. Now, in the late phase, it's different. Now you get into a situation where there's a self awareness The image of what punk is supposed to look like becomes codified, right? So there's a formula there. The entire culture, the behavior, also commodified, and it takes on a sort of messaging function. So it starts to like be about something that you could say. So it goes from like destructive to positive, I guess you could say, from the early phase, more sort of rejecting of social norms, and to the later phase, more as a possibility, I would say, for a social category in the mainstream. But I don't know if I'd go quite that far, and that's kind of why I've got the mainstreaming with a question mark there. And so this is a picture of Marshall McLuhan, who's a famous media critic, on the academic side, and he had this famous saying, which was, "The medium is the message." And so if punk is, and just think about that, the medium is the message. So that means that whatever you're trying to say, the medium in which it is, that message is delivered, has as much to do with what that message is saying as the message itself. Okay, so that's what is meant by the medium of the message. That's my take on it, at least. So if we back up and say, if punk music is like this scream of the defiant problem child, right? So it's an outburst that has as much to do with, the freedom to have an outburst as it is about self-determination. Then how can music communicate the scream, right? So when you consider those two positions at the same time, then punk kind of is at the limits of what is musical, right? So we're not talking about a music genre that is trying to be melodic or a full expression or staying within various, rules of musicology. In fact, it's oftentimes just, if you know 2 or 3 chords on a guitar and can play loud as hell and are mostly in tune, and scream your bad attitude or whatever, you're kind of, you're there in terms of what you need musically. And so as that idea of what its relationship to musicality is lines up really well in terms of its gesture to the limits of society. And so it's making space for and embracing what is almost musical or what is almost normal, right? So it's kind of at the edge, and it's embracing and making space for those who are at the edge of the mainstream and standing in the margins, just as its music is on the edge of musicality. Okay, so in the early phase, it's rejecting social norms. So this Ramones video that I've got on Canvas called "I Want to Be Sedated" has the band sort of sitting at a breakfast table after an all-nighter, and then everybody's getting up to go to work, so you can kind of see the nurse and the fireman and the doctor and the lawyer and the teacher, like all these very regular categories of people are passing through and around this breakfast table. And so there's a heavy sort of contrast, right, with the band who is at the center of all of that. And you also have, it's not just the rejection of that, but also musicality itself. So there's a band called No Means No, which has a guitarist who is famous for sort of starting but not finishing solos, and so kind of defying and bringing into ridicule the idea of musical structure. And so it's a very defiant, sort of shaking the foundations of what expectations there may be. So, in the early phase, punk is, there's no guarantees about songwriting or musicianship. Those things are at least beside the point, but they're just deconstruction, so breaking those things apart, breaking them down, and revealing the sort of those expectations or the formulas underneath are much more to the point of what punk is about in the early phase. Now in the later phase, now you've got a certain degree of codification. I don't know, it's not mainstream, but you can go into a shop, for example, and be like, I want the punk look, right? It may not be a mainstream shop that everybody goes to, but this would have never been possible in the early phase because these were clothes that were just destroyed and wrecked to however your mood was. And so it was a much more personal, intimate, and organic gesture in that situation. And so in the later phase, it's more normative, a little bit more normative. There's the existence of a punk look. You can get the punk shoes. You see those to the right. And so it's moving out of the underground a little bit more. And so the punk identity is, through this codification, it starts to be commodified. And so instead of anti-fashion, right, the use of safety pins to kind of cobble together shredded clothes, now we're in this kind of new fashion where the safety pin itself is a symbol, sort of what would you call that, an accessory or like a piece of jewelry that signifies what punk was. It's no longer like actually utilitarian where it's holding together clothes, but it's like on a necklace or on a chain or whatever. So the safety pin, the mohawk, these are mainstays of the quote punk wardrobe, right? But the idea of a punk wardrobe itself would have been so completely laughable to the earlier phase, and that's what makes it great. So when you see bands that are supposed to be like proto-punk, new punk, like Green Day, Blink, 182, I call them operators of the late punk sleight of hand, which means that they are working to satirize mainstream pop. So they're taking this kind of punk attitude, but they're also actually mainstream pop themselves. And so you're not supposed to notice that part about those bands, which I find ironic and hilarious at the same time. And I invite you to as well. And so I guess when you look at, the kind of coming and going of punk music, I would not say that it was mainstreamed, but you can see the efforts and the way that mainstreaming is working in the kind of fashion and the way that punk allows for an authenticity claim, I suppose, in certain cultural and subcultural movements, and also in the music business with the bands I just mentioned. And so I oftentimes use the metaphor of fruition and decay. So you think of like a strawberry plant early in the season, starting to bud a little bit, and the fruit is kind of coming forth, and then finally it's starting to turn red, and then it comes into full ripeness, and then if nobody picks it, it basically starts to rot on the vine and everything, and then the whole cycle goes again. So genres are not unlike that. In other words, they have their kind of high point of ripeness, and they also have the time when they're sort of coming on, and then it's like too late, right? They're past their prime, and so this is a true question I'll give to you guys to put in the answer in the questions or in the comments. But, as a music fans, which I assume you all are, where do you stand, or where do you draw your sustenance, right? So sustenance being like, where do you get your nourishment? So some music fans identify, of punk that is, identify the early destructive phase as like the real deal, right? So that's like, it's authentic punk music. But others, like on the industry side in particular, labels, broadcasters, merchandisers, they may see the later phase as the true blossoming because that's what's profitable. That's what kind of people can, it's more palatable, like it's not as offensive, and more able to kind of signify mainstream experience to a certain extent. And so, what's your take on that? Thought I'd put that out there as just a concluding question here, but that's my take on punk music, a near mainstream experience, but didn't quite get there, and that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. All right, I will see you with part 2 of 1980 here shortly.